I never thought I'd see it. The flames raced across the HOA president's house, roaring louder than anything I'd ever heard. In seconds, her perfect home, the one she'd always flaunted, was reduced to nothing but smoke and ash. I stood frozen, remembering how just weeks before I begged her to let me install fireproof siding. But Karen, with her smug smile, denied me, said it didn't match the neighborhood's look. Now, as the fire devoured her home first, I realized something. This wasn't just bad luck. It was her own doing. And that's when I understood Karen had no idea what she'd really started. Karen had always been the kind of person who believed rules were everything. In Ridgerest, she didn't just lead the HOA, she was the law. Her smile was always just a little too tight, like she knew something you didn't. And, in a way, she did. She knew how to make everyone follow her rules, how to wield her power like a weapon. The rest of the board, they were puppets too afraid of her to say anything. I first met Karen when I submitted my request for fireproof siding. The moment she heard my voice, I could see the shift. The warm, welcoming facade dropped. She didn't care that my house sat on a ridge, or that wildfires were becoming a serious threat. No, to Karen all that mattered was aesthetic harmony. "We can't have the neighborhood looking like a patchwork quilt," she'd said, the edge in her voice, cold and dismissive. Her approval was always impossible to earn, unless you bowed to her every whim. She'd mocked my concerns, dismissed the experts, and made sure I knew my request didn't matter. That was just how Karen operated. She didn't care about safety, about logic, about anything except control. And when I pushed back, that's when she unleashed her power, threats, fines, and that damned gavel. But she didn't know who she was messing with. She had no idea what I would do to protect my home. I moved to Ridgerest after losing my first home in a wildfire. It wasn't just a house I lost, it was everything. The fire came fast, unpredictable, and unforgiving. The wind shifted in the middle of the night, and by morning, the flames had already swallowed the ridge we lived on. I remember standing in the front yard, a garden hose in hand, watching the fire devour the house we'd spent years building. The siding caught first, then the roof. By the time I realized we couldn't save it, it was too late. My wife and I grabbed whatever we could, but the fire didn't care. Everything we had, every memory turned to ash. The experience changed me. The constant smell of smoke, the fear that never quite left. Every time the wind shifted wrong, I would flash back to that night. It wasn't just the loss of a house, it was the trauma of being powerless in the face of something so overwhelming. I swore I would never be in that position again. When I found this new house in Ridgerest, I thought I was finally safe. It was a quiet neighborhood, away from the danger zones nestled along the ridge, but far enough from the front lines. At least that's what I believed at first. I settled in, built a new life, but then came the HOA, and then came Karen. It didn't take long for me to realize that Ridgerest wasn't the haven I'd hoped for. The HOA might have seemed like just another suburban nuisance at first, but when Karen started enforcing her arbitrary rules with an iron fist, I began to see the cracks. She wasn't just making people follow rules, she was controlling them, suffocating them under her idea of perfection. The worst part, she didn't seem to care if her rules put us all in danger. All that mattered was keeping the neighborhood looking pristine. When I asked to install fireproof siding on my home, I thought it was a simple request. I thought Karen would understand. But the way she shot me down with that smug smile told me everything I needed to know. To her, safety didn't matter. The community's image did. And that was when I realized I was going to have to fight for this house, for my family's safety, and for the home I'd built from the ashes of my past. At first it was subtle, little violations here and there, things I could have ignored if they hadn't been so personal. The first came a week after I moved in, a simple note about trimming my hedge, which had overgrown by maybe an inch. A week later, there was another one. My backyard fence wasn't aligned to HOA standards, according to Karen. At first, I thought nothing of it, but soon I began to see patterns. Each note had a certain tone, a sense of surveillance, and then there was the way the neighbors would talk. Everyone had a story about Karen. The woman who dared plant drought-tolerant succulents was now the subject of whispers. The family that painted their door a shade too bold was suddenly fined. I didn't realize it at the time, but Karen's control was insidious. She didn't just enforce the rules she watched, she reported, and she made sure everyone knew who was in charge. And I started to feel it. There was no escaping her gaze, no ignoring the ever-growing sense of discomfort that came every time I stepped outside my house. Then came the fireproof siding issue. I'd done everything right. I presented Karen with the paperwork, fire safety ratings, manufacturer guarantees, and even approval from the color review committee. It was a textbook submission, but Karen wouldn't budge. "I'm sorry," she said flatly, "but this doesn't fit our community's aesthetic." I tried to explain the fireproof siding would help protect my home, especially given how close Ridgerest was to the ridge. Wildfires had ravaged nearby towns the year before. Karen's response, a dismissive wave. "You're exaggerating," she said. "There are no fires here. You're just trying to make a mountain out of a molehill." That was when I realized Karen didn't care about safety, about logic, about anything except making sure the neighborhood stayed perfect. She wasn't going to let anything disrupt her vision, even if it meant risking my home. A few days later, I got a violation notice. I had removed a small test strip of siding, following Karen's own instructions for the inspection. But instead of thanking me for complying, she slapped me with a fine for altering the exterior without authorization. The fine, $250 per day until I replaced the strip I had removed. It wasn't about the siding anymore, it was about her control, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. As wildfire season approached, the tension grew. I kept watching the sky, monitoring weather reports, keeping an eye on the ridge behind our neighborhood. The winds were picking up earlier than usual. Then came the warning signs, small but telling. A neighbor mentioned that their kid had noticed the smell of smoke on a morning jog. A few others talked about seeing ash flakes drifting down from the mountains. Everyone else went about their day as usual, but I knew better. I'd been through it before. I started checking my house every day. My heart would race as I walked around the exterior, inspecting the siding, the vents, the brush that had begun to grow along the edges of my property. Wildfires were unpredictable, and with the dry conditions we were having this year, I could feel the danger creeping closer. I tried to talk to Karen again, explaining how the fireproof siding would make my house safer. But her reply was always the same, dismissive, condescending, and almost smug. "There's no reason to panic," she would say. "Everything here is fine. We don't need to cater to your paranoia." But the more I tried to explain, the more I saw how dangerous Karen's refusal to listen was. I knew I couldn't sit by and wait for disaster to strike. I was running out of time. That's when I decided to take action. I called the fire marshal, requesting an inspection. With my experience in wildfire response, I knew how important it was to get an expert's opinion. The fire marshal agreed to come out within a few days. When the inspector Caldwell arrived, he immediately saw what I had been talking about. He walked through Ridgerest, looking over the houses, nodding as he assessed the fire risk. "I see the problem," he said. "These materials aren't up to standard. If a fire hit this ridge, we'd be in serious trouble." As we walked around the neighborhood, Karen appeared striding toward us with her tablet in hand, her face already tight with suspicion. She didn't even greet the inspector, instead launching into her usual spiel about aesthetic standards and neighborhood unity. Caldwell didn't even flinch. "The state's fire safety codes override HOA rules," he told her flatly. "You can't forbid fire-resistant materials." Karen, though, wouldn't back down. "But this doesn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic," she insisted. "It's not about looks, it's about survival," Caldwell snapped. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just blind to the risks. She was actively making the neighborhood more vulnerable. This wasn't just about one house, it was about the entire community's safety. I don't know why I didn't expect it, but the wind suddenly changed. The smoke, which had been faint for days, became thick, and the air was heavy, with a metallic taste. I stepped outside and I could smell it, the sharp, acrid scent of burning pine. The sky had gone from clear to a grim, smoky orange in less than an hour. My heart dropped. I went inside to check my phone for updates. The wind was shifting. Fires were already starting to spread in the valley, and the Oak Valley fire had started to creep closer. Within hours, it was on our doorstep. The sirens went off soon after. I looked toward the ridge. The fire was moving fast, faster than anyone expected. The air felt thick, oppressive. I grabbed my emergency bag and ran outside, looking around for my neighbors. Some were still arguing with Karen about the fire risk, others seemed paralyzed by fear, but none of them were taking the necessary precautions. I didn't have time to explain. I needed to move. I turned back to the ridge and saw it flames had already crested the hill, and smoke was billowing toward us. I didn't have time to warn everyone. The fire was already here. The HOA meeting was packed, the air heavy with tension. As soon as I stepped up to speak, the murmur in the room quieted. This wasn't just another community meeting. Today, Karen's reign over Ridgerest was coming to an end. Karen sat at the front with her usual smug composure, but I could see the flicker of panic in her eyes as I began. Karen's refusal to approve my fireproof siding, I began keeping my voice steady, has left this community vulnerable to the wildfire risk we all know is coming. And now, thanks to her, we're facing the consequences. Her expression darkened, but she tried to maintain control. "This is nonsense," she said, her voice rising. "I've been a responsible leader. I've made decisions for the good of the community. "You made decisions for the good of your image," I shot back, "not for the safety of anyone here." The crowd reacted, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. Some people were looking at Karen for the first time, seeing her for what she was. The once invincible HOA president was losing her grip on the room, and she could feel it. The sheriff, who had been standing quietly in the back, stepped forward. He placed a thick folder on the table and slid it toward the board members. "We have some documentation here," he said, his tone firm. "These are the violation notices Karen sent, the emails from the fire marshal, and the fire safety records." I watched Karen's face fall as the sheriff pulled out a series of documents. One of them was the fire marshal's report confirming that the fireproof siding I had requested was state-approved, tested, and crucial to wildfire prevention. That siding, I continued, was not just a cosmetic improvement, it was a safety measure, and Karen knew it. The board members started to shift uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One of them, Mr. Thompson, cleared his throat. "Karen, is this true?" Karen's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. This is an exaggeration," she stammered. "I made decisions based on what I thought was best for our neighborhood. No one else here was concerned about wildfires, but the evidence was undeniable." The sheriff held up the fire marshal's report. "This document clearly states that fireproof siding would have reduced ignition risks. Your denial of it endangered this entire community." The crowd began to react more openly now, some with disbelief, some with anger. Karen's lies were crumbling, and there was no one left to defend her. Karen tried to regain control, but she was already losing the battle. Her eyes flicked from the sheriff to the board, then to the community members, who were now glaring at her disillusioned. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood looking nice. I wasn't trying to put anyone at risk." But it was too late. The damage had been done. The sheriff stepped forward again, his voice calm but unwavering. "Karen, your actions are not just a mistake. They're a violation of public safety laws. And for that, you're being held accountable." I could feel the shift in the room. The board members who had once bowed to Karen's every whim were now looking at her with judgment in their eyes. Some of them avoided her gaze entirely, unable to meet her eyes. And then the sheriff made it official. "Given the negligence here and the way you've disregarded state regulations, I'm placing you under arrest for criminal negligence and obstruction of safety protocols." Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Her arrogance, her control, had led her here, and now she was powerless. As the sheriff cuffed her, the room erupted into murmurs of relief. People exchanged looks, some nodding, others wiping away tears. It was over. The once powerful Karen, the woman who had tormented us with fines and threats, was being led out of the room in handcuffs. And for the first time, I felt a weight lifting from my chest. She had made us feel small, helpless, but now she was facing the consequences of her actions. I turned to the crowd, taking a deep breath. It's not over yet. We have a lot of rebuilding to do, but today we've taken the first step. We've fought for our homes, for our safety, and for the future of Ridgerest. The crowd began to clap slowly at first, then building into a full wave of applause. It was a strange feeling, relief, anger, and a sense of unity all at once. Karen's control was broken, and the community was finally free. It felt surreal walking out of that meeting. The tension that had hung over Ridgerest for so long was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet. People were still talking in small groups, some comforting each other, others starting to make plans for what came next. But there was a sense of lightness, a release from the weight Karen had placed on all of us. I stood at the back of the room for a moment, letting the noise wash over me. I couldn't stop thinking about how long we'd all lived in fear of her. How many of us had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid of the consequences, but now with her arrest, it was like a door had been opened. There were no more secrets, no more whispers behind closed doors. I saw Lucas, my neighbor across the room. He caught my eye and gave me a quick nod, a silent acknowledgement. He knew what this fight had cost me. We'd both lived through fires that had taken everything from us once before, and now we were both standing here ready to rebuild. I walked over to him, and he gave me a clap on the back. "You did it, man. We're safe now." But the relief wasn't immediate. As the community started to talk about the next steps, I couldn't help but think about what we had lost and how much work there was to do. It didn't take long for the legal consequences to come down. The county launched an investigation into Karen's actions, and the board members who had enabled her were forced to answer for their complicity. Many of them resigned, some out of fear of legal repercussions, others out of guilt. Karen was facing criminal charges for negligence and obstruction, and the fire marshal's report was going to be used in the case against her. In the weeks that followed, Karen's reputation fell apart. Her once sterling record as HOA president was shredded, and her insurance claim for the house was promptly denied. I overheard one of the officers at the meeting tell her that her neglect of fire safety protocols had likely voided her policy. Karen's face was a far cry from the confident woman who had strutted around in her bright pink blazer, making demands and issuing fines. She had lost everything: her home, her position, and most of all, her control. The board that followed wasn't much better, but it was a start. They agreed to adopt the fireproof siding I had requested alongside other necessary fire safety upgrades. Karen had mocked the idea of change, but now in her absence, the community was finally moving forward. In the weeks that followed, Ridgeris began to feel like a new place. People started to work together, putting aside their old grudges to ensure we'd never face the same dangers again. The streets that had once been silent and cold now felt full of life. Neighbors checking in on each other, exchanging fire safety tips and helping with repairs. The first day I saw work crews installing the fireproof siding on my house, I felt a strange sense of closure. This wasn't just about building something new. It was about protecting our future. It was about never letting Karen's mistakes define us again. One afternoon, I stood at the edge of my property, watching the workers as they completed the final touches on my new siding. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, and for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. As I turned to go inside, I saw Karen walking up the street. She was different now, broken, humbled. Her once pristine blazer was gone, replaced with a simple jacket, and she was walking with her head down. She paused when she saw me, her eyes briefly meeting mine. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice small. "I was wrong. You tried to warn me. I should have listened. I didn't know how to respond." Part of me wanted to hold on to my anger to remind her of everything she'd put me through. But another part of me understood that it wasn't worth it. We were both survivors of something much larger than ourselves, and now all that mattered was rebuilding. "You can still make it right," I said, the words coming more easily than I expected. "We all can." She nodded, looking at the new siding on my house. "I know," she whispered. "I will." I watched her walk away, the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders, as it was for all of us. Ridgerist wasn't just rebuilding homes. It was rebuilding trust, community, and the realization that sometimes things had to fall apart to come back stronger. As I stood there watching the last of the sunset fade, I felt a quiet sense of hope. We had faced the fire in more ways than one, and now we were ready to move forward. Together,